Hi everyone, today I'll be talking about art therapy trailblazer Wayne Ramirez. So I want to begin by giving a very condensed biography of his life and work to help better understand his background. So Wayne Ramirez was born to Puerto Rican parents in 1941 in New York City. He was introduced to the concept of art therapy by his mother, and I'll read a quote by Ramirez from the Journal of the American Art Therapy Association. He writes, "She told me that she had read about artists and therapists who use art to help people, and they call it art therapy. This would be a wonderful thing to do as a career. At the time, I envisioned myself becoming a competent artist and perhaps doing some teaching. I did not comprehend the prophecy of her words." He completed a bachelor's and master's in fine art while playing semi-professional baseball and soccer and while working as a house parent at a treatment center for children. And soon afterwards, he became an art therapist and educator, and since then has been instrumental in the founding of various initiatives, including the American Art Therapy Association, which I'll sometimes refer to as ADA going forward. So I couldn't find records of Ramirez explicitly voicing specific themes that he adhered to, but his life's work shows how he embodied his values in impactful ways. And the four main themes of his work that I've chosen are advocacy, accessibility, innovation, and diversity. And in some cases, these themes really blend into one another, as you'll see throughout the presentation. So Ramirez advocated for art therapy as a profession and field of study in his own right, through his administrative role as educator and as an active member and leader of the American Art Therapy Association. He saw the importance of offering undergraduate education in art therapy, particularly to those who might not be able to afford graduate level studies. This was also his way of advocating for diversity of experience and thought in the art therapy practice. He knew that there was valuable insight among underprivileged people who could serve their communities if given the opportunity. In the late 1970s, he created a statewide curriculum in Pennsylvania that included training materials to help art therapists grow in professional development. And alongside his wife, Marianne, he also developed a festival program for children with disabilities in Pennsylvania called the Very Special Arts Festival Program. He also worked on expanding the definition of art therapy to be broader than just within a psychiatric setting, which I'll talk about later in the presentation. So Ramirez helped advance art therapy to become an accessible practice, both for the client and the therapist. In 1989, Hurricane Hugo hit the US Virgin Islands and caused devastation not only to the land, but to the welfare of the communities. Ramirez saw an opportunity to respond immediately to this crisis by converting a 23-passenger bus into what he called the Artsmobile that transported a handful of visual and performing artists, as well as numerous art supplies. Using the Artsmobile was a way of bringing art to the community, and especially to the children who had experienced trauma as a result of the hurricane. And rather than having them come to him, he made his art therapy practice physically accessible by coming to them. In a review for a book called Art Therapy, Race, and Culture, he writes that he recognizes the importance of advocating for the disenfranchised in society who have the, quote, highest incidence of mental and physical disorders, and that these individuals, quote, have the least access to these services. So his innovation in creating the Artsmobile addressed the need for accessibility to essential services like therapy in the midst of crisis and in the midst of underprivileged communities. The Artsmobile was called a historical model of the mobile art on a cart. So in this way, he contributed to pioneering new ways of conveying art therapy. Ramirez wrote a book called The Little Island School Bus that became the Artsmobile, which was inspired by his experience. And his work on the Artsmobile also inspired a film called Special Children of Paradise. And like mentioned before, he worked on a curriculum for educators and created a festival for children with varying disabilities. He saw the potential in collaborating with artists and non-artists alike, which would have been more rare at the time. And continuing in that vein, Ramirez sought to reach out to various professions to gain wisdom and knowledge to incorporate into art therapy and to collaborate. And his interest in a wide range of fields at an early age, from fine arts to sports, for example, gives me the impression that he always valued diversity of experience. In his early years as an art therapist, he worked on expanding his experience with clients of various ages and psychiatric conditions, and later focused much of his energy on working with children with trauma and/or disabilities in devastated areas. On another note, he began to distance himself from ADA in later years, in part because of the lack of cultural, racial, and gender diversity in the organization. I see this as a lesson and reminder for future generations on how to make reparations so that voices and opinions don't get talked over or lost or swept under the rug. Stand in My Shoes, which you see here, is a painting by Wayne Ramirez that was selected for the Embracing Our Differences 2021 art exhibit in Florida. He writes, "My painting illustrates a young Black girl wearing the iconic Mary Jane shoes with bobby socks. From 1904 to the present, these shoes have been traditionally advertised as dress shoes for little white girls. The painting's subliminal message is, my shoes and socks are like yours, and I am like you. Having a Black child wearing the shoes and socks makes her a universal symbol representing all young girls and the challenges they face from iconic commercial stereotypes created by the white-dominated advertising world. At first glance, Stand in My Shoes may seem to be just a realistic painting, but take a second glance and consider who is standing in them." Ramirez was involved in the founding of the first official association of art therapists in America through the Wisconsin Art Therapy Association, which later impacted ADA, or the creation of ADA. Jordan Potash writes, "Art therapists across the country contributed greatly to the profession, but those in Wisconsin, where Ramirez was, were the first to formally organize with acknowledged bylaws and to incorporate as a nonprofit association in 1969. Ramirez influenced the determination of licensure as well for practicing art therapy in different contexts. He challenged the 5 years experience in a psychiatric setting that was expected for art therapy qualification at the time, seeing it as a hindrance to art therapy being practiced in various settings. He worked hard to lobby for the inclusion of the title art therapist in the US Department of Labor's Dictionary of Occupational Titles and the Health Careers Guidebook. Art therapists today benefit from the advocacy Ramirez did to promote art therapy, not only in psychiatric settings, but also in educational and community settings. He was also a strong proponent of offering both graduate and undergraduate curricula in art therapy. He opened up new ways of thinking about the use of art therapy, like how collaboration with other professions like community artists, museum educators, and art teachers, in addition to mental health professionals and responders, could make art therapy more accessible and effective. We're also seeing how art therapy can be made accessible by making it portable, like in classroom settings. His clients were mostly children with disabilities, specifically with, quote, emotional disturbances and intellectual disabilities, as Jordan Potash writes in his article. His introduction to working in a therapeutic context was as a house parent at a residential treatment center for children, at the Southern Home for Children and the Devereux schools, both in Philadelphia. And then later he became the director of the art therapy department at the Milwaukee Psychiatric Hospital. And then in the late 1970s, he moved back to Puerto Rico, where he established a center for students with learning disabilities and a gallery to showcase their artwork at the Robinson School. So throughout his career, he's worked as an educator, an administrator, grant writer, counselor, artist, and then, of course, an art therapist. During a series of Category 5 hurricanes in the US Virgin Islands, Ramirez and his community were greatly affected. He writes, "The devastation to the islands led to community stress and trauma due to loss of electrical power, homes and personal property, and lack of access to food, water, shelter, fuel, and services. But paradoxically, I also remember the resilience of communities coming together in the spirit of love, hope, and healing, and a special arts project. So as a survivor of this natural disaster, Ramirez was both trying to pick up the pieces of the aftermath and ministering to others through art therapy. And it must have felt impossible at times, and yet rewarding to see the positive impact his art collaborations had on the community in the long term. In terms of his involvement at ADA, his work in advocacy was what motivated him to continue working. But in later years, the multitude of differences in opinion between himself and the leading committee at ADA led him to limit his involvement with them, which was a great loss for the association and future art therapists that would have benefited from his input. But in the end, it was his decision to make. It's hard to know exactly which materials Ramirez would have used. Potash writes that descriptions of his pioneering work are not readily available. But given the fact that he worked with performing artists, I can imagine that playing with puppets and puppet making was used, at least to some extent, in his practice. And I'll show you a video in a second.
Hi, my name is Wayne Ramirez. I've been a member of ADA since its inception. And I wish ADA happy 50th year anniversary.
Mm-hmm.
Art therapy is going to be around forever. As long as humanity exists, art therapy will also exist. Happy 50th.
So before we move on to the art exercise, I wanted to show you this brief video that you just saw of Wayne Ramirez speaking. I think it's delightful to get to know our trailblazers in embodied form and not just through written text. And I was lucky enough to find this video on the Wisconsin Art Therapy Association Facebook page. So for our art exercise, this one is inspired by child drama facilitator Matt Buchanan, but I've adapted it based on some of the experientials and classes we've had so far at TADI. So let's dive in. So take 5 minutes to look around your home for an object. It can be anything. Once you've chosen an object, spend 5 minutes getting to know it, observe its characteristics, and record what you see in your journal. What drew you to this object? What adjectives would you use to describe it? Based on your observations, give your object a name and personality and record in your journal. Who is your object? What are their likes and dislikes? Does your object have a story? And this is optional, but using a marker or any other art materials you choose, you can add features to your object like eyes, hair, limbs, etc. And my question for you today is, what does accessible art therapy look like to you? What does it mean to you? You can share examples of how you've experienced accessible art therapy or share what you hope it could look like. Thank you. And here are my sources.